think about mind control, I think about controlling your own mind. Because while I am obviously a physical person and I embrace physicality, we are our minds. What it means and where the you actually is, and whether there's a soul or a brain or whatever, your heart or some other conjured up place. job, I got a good family, I got a nice house, I'm in pretty good shape. Sometimes I skip workouts, sometimes I sleep in, and sometimes I eat bad. Does discipline ever fail you? No. Actually, discipline does not fail me. I fail discipline. That's what happens on days where I veer off the path and onto the slippery slope of weakness. It isn't discipline's fault. It is my fault. I'm the one that's being weak. It is my fault. I'm the one that's not holding the line. I'm the one that is deciding to take the short-term gratification instead of the long-term domination. When I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do, and that's get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. When laziness creeps in, it's not discipline that opened the door. It's me. It's me rationalizing and explaining and justifying that laziness. When I decide to take the easy path instead of the righteous path of discipline, that is my decision. That's all on me. That's all on me. It's me deciding to cave to my weaknesses and become a slave to them. And when I make that error, when I let discipline down, there's only one thing to do. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. Step it up and go harder and push for it. Get back on the path. Get back on it. For your transgressions, cleanse yourself in the fire and the suffering of the discipline, and get back on the path. The hard, unrelenting path of discipline. That path that leads to freedom.
Okay, so I'm about to read from the communist newspaper a few articles about Zoran Mamdani, right? Because he's this self-described socialist who was elected mayor of New York City, which is pretty cool. But I think personally he's going to be like AOC, so we will see. So I'm going to go in chronological order. We have July 2025. The establishment is stunned by Zoran's New York City upset. So I'm going to read for about 20-30 minutes, then meditate for about 30 minutes while listening to an audiobook. We'll continue listening to audiobooks while doing yoga and then martial arts. So it's like 2 hours, about 30 minutes each thing. Reading, meditation, yoga, martial arts, every day forever. And you'll feel great, I promise. So, Establishment stunned by Zoran's New York City upset. Mamdani was polling at just 1% in February. Now he's won the New York City mayoral Democratic primary, a welcome kick in the teeth to the establishment. But from a strategic standpoint, is this a step forward? This continues on page 4, and Pikachu the cat is coming to join us. Maybe. Zoran Mamdani wins New York City primary, but is this a win for socialism? In a major political upset, Zoran Mamdani, a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, has won the Democratic primary for New York City mayor. The 33-year-old defeated former governor and establishment favorite Andrew Cuomo, winning 43% of the first choice votes against Cuomo's 36%. The Wall Street Journal observed, quote, "The epicenter of global capitalism may soon have a socialist mayor." Mamdani's victory is yet another sign of the times, as the global crisis of capitalism forces millions of workers and young people to search for new political answers. His victory shocked not only the well-heeled Democratic Party elite, but also the titans of Wall Street. In an opinion piece titled, quote, "The People's Republic of New York City," the Wall Street Journal's editorial board fretted about the possible rise of, quote, "left-wing economic populism," while hedge fund billionaire Dan Loeb wrote on X, "It's officially hot commie summer." And they have here some New York Post headlines, and it says NYC SOS, who will save city after radical socialist batters Cuomo in Dem mayoral primary. And race for mayor, Mamma Mia NYC, Zoran zaps Cuo in Dem mayoral primary. And the Wall Street Journal headline is "Wall Street panics over prospect of a socialist running New York City. Democratic socialist Zoran Mamdani's stunning primary win is rattling the financial industry that had backed Andrew Cuomo." Continuing with the article, whether Mamdani will win the general election in November remains to be seen. Incumbent Mayor Eric Adams is also in the race as an independent, and the now defeated Cuomo could run as an independent too. Still, a self-described socialist is the chalk bet to be the next mayor of America's largest metropolis and one of the most economically and culturally important cities in the world. With over 4 months until the general election, the ruling class is already attacking him, threatening capital flight, and accusing him of anti-Semitism due to his mild opposition to Israel. However, what the ruling class is afraid of is neither Zoran himself nor his mildly progressive policy proposals. He ran on a soft liberal program on the capitalist Democratic Party ballot. What worries them are the people who voted for him and what his victory represents. They're afraid that a section of the working class will feel more confident and emboldened by Zoran's victory. Why did Mamdani win? Zoran won support by putting the city's cost of living crisis at the forefront of his campaign. His program promises to freeze rents, make buses fast and free, provide free childcare, and more. The primary results reveal a mood of deep anger and frustration at the Democratic Party establishment. Zoran's main opposition was New York City's scandal-ridden ex-governor Andrew Cuomo, son of 3-term Democratic Governor Mario Cuomo. He seemed to have every advantage: name, recognition, experience, the backing of his party, including endorsements from Bill Clinton and Michael Bloomberg, and millions in campaign donations. While Zoran was polling 1% in February, Cuomo gained a 40-point lead when he entered the race. But at a time when the Democrats are more discredited and unpopular than ever, these connections actually worked against him. Ordinary New Yorkers, especially young people, were eager to vote for someone they see as a political outsider. This attitude was summed up by one Queens resident who told the Communist newspaper, "I'd be lying if I said I wasn't a little happy about Cuomo getting endorsements from both the Democratic Party and the New York Times, then getting his teeth kicked in." Zoran's win is part of a broader phenomenon of distrust and anger at the political system and both major parties. which has created a huge political vacuum. Trump was able to tap into this discontent in 2016 and 2024 with his presidential victories. Many commentators characterized his wins as a shift to the right in U.S. politics. Some even highlighted a swing toward Trump in New York City last fall as evidence of a broader reactionary shift. But Zorin's victory shows that there has not been a fundamental shift to the right in New York City or across the country, but rather a shift toward anti-establishment candidates on both the quote right and the quote left, due to the growing class anger in U.S. society. 42,000 people volunteered for Zorin's campaign in one way or another: door knocking, phone banking, tabling, leafleting, etc. This amount of active support for a self-described socialist candidate would have been unthinkable just 15 years ago, and shows a deep desire among a certain layer of society to find a way to fight against the political establishment. Should communists support his bid for mayor? And here we have one of his flyers: Democrat for mayor, Zorin, vote June 24. And the subtitle for that image says, "Communists cannot support Zorin as long as he is running as a Democrat. That would be crossing a fundamental class line." Many on the left see Zorin's primary win as a clear victory for the socialist movement and consider it a foregone conclusion that they must support him in November. By all accounts, he seems sincere in his desire to lower the cost of living in New York. But while it's satisfying to see someone like Andrew Cuomo defeated, and some will argue that anyone is better than Eric Adams, communists need to take a sober and scientific approach to questioning the electoral strategy. How communists view elections. The starting point should be our long-term strategic goal: the working class winning power through a socialist revolution that proceeds to dismantle the capitalist state, replaces it with a workers' state, and nationalizes the key levers of industry into a democratically planned economy under workers' control. A successful revolution will be the culmination of the centuries-long struggle between the two main classes in modern society, the workers and the capitalists. The working class can only succeed in this fight if we are conscious that a fundamental divide exists between the classes, and that we constitute a class of our own, with our own interests irreconcilably opposed to those of the capitalists. We must wage a united struggle as a class against our class enemy, the capitalists. The role of communists is to sharpen and facilitate the development of this class consciousness at every stage of the struggle. This means fighting for class independence in all spheres. The working class needs our own program, methods, and organizations, including our own political party. This is how communists view elections, as part of the broader class struggle, not an isolated tactical wins or losses. Any campaign run or supported by communists should be a step in the direction of increasing working class consciousness, confidence, and unity. Blurring the class line. Ever since Bernie Sanders first ran for president in 2015, a debate has reemerged in the U.S. socialist movement over whether to run socialist candidates within the capitalist Democratic Party. But this is not a secondary question. It gets to the very heart of the matter. Can the working class use the capitalist parties to achieve our goal? Or do we need our party of our own? The Democrats and Republicans are not neutral institutions. They are controlled by capitalists to serve and defend their class interests and their system. From this viewpoint, it is clear that communists cannot support Zorin as long as he is running as a Democrat. This would be crossing the fundamental class line. In effect, it would be saying to the working class that the Democratic Party can be trusted or utilized to some degree or another, a dangerous illusion that only leads to disaster. And a personal note, Lenin was constantly repeating and quoted that, "Don't trust liberals, they will betray you." If you're an activist and you're going to protests and the liberals are collaborating with police to plan that protest, that's a dangerous situation. You're walking into a trap. If you're walking hand in hand with Democrats towards a police line, they're just trying to get a bunch of people arrested on minor protesting charges. So now you're in the system, you have a criminal record, and with each successive protest charge, you get more and more time in jail or prison, right? Getting yourself arrested on purpose is a really dumb idea. And Democrats and liberals will walk you into that trap. Don't trust anyone at a protest who encourages you to sit down and get arrested on purpose. That person is a cop, whether they know it or not. Continuing on. Rather than helping to clarify the class divide in society, running within the Democrats blurs this line by implying that one wing of the ruling class is preferable to the other and somehow that they're on our side. The outline of a new party? Communists are not opposed to participating in bourgeois elections in principle. Electoral campaigns could be utilized for the purpose of exposing the problems of capitalism in campaigning for a communist program and a class-independent workers' party. In fact, the immediate problem facing the American working class is its lack of independent political party, one that is not controlled by the exploiting class, which could be used to fight for the interests of the working class as a whole, including running working class candidates for office. Again, a Lenin quote that I recently read was, any cook should be able to become the president, or the exact quote was, what do they call the rulers in other more socialist countries? I forget the term right now. But any cook should be able to run for office as prime minister and win. Continuing on, Zorin's massive core of 42,000 volunteers could have provided the nucleus of just such a working class party. He could have run as an independent socialist and called on these volunteers to sign party cards and get to work recruiting co-workers, family, friends, etc. Even if this reduced his chances of winning this particular election, the formation of this party would have been a tremendous leap forward for the working class movement as a whole. It would have prepared the basis for a genuine class struggle. At the ballot box, in the workplaces, and in the streets, the RCA would actively and energetically support such a campaign while offering comradely criticism where appropriate. While communists pursue a strategy aimed towards achieving a successful socialist strategy, unfortunately Zorin and the others in the DSA do not operate within this framework. Hundreds of thousands of honest socialists want to see a better world. They want to fight for the working class, and many want to see the end of capitalism altogether. But there's a fundamental flaw at the heart of reformism. Reformists believe that they can achieve these ends without a fundamental break from the capitalist system. As a result, regardless of their intentions, they limit their tactics and program to what is, quote, achievable within the capitalist system and within the parties of the enemy class. But the problems facing the working class can only be resolved through the complete overthrow of the capitalist system. What would it take to improve workers' lives? Advocates for running within the Democratic Party claim that it is justified to cross the class line to win elections. They argue that once in office, these candidates can enact a program that will improve the lives of workers and increase the popularity of socialism. But the reality is that Zorin's program will be extremely difficult to achieve and will face overwhelming barriers that can only be surmounted by class war methods, including strikes, workplace occupations, and mass mobilizations. In the absence of militant class struggle on the streets, Mamdani's efforts will have minimal impact on the lives of workers in New York. Remaining within the limits of the class enemy system will force him to preside over a further decline in working class living standards. The result will be a broad disappointment and possibly even disillusionment with socialism altogether. Affordable grocery stores? One example of the main planks of Zorin's program is to make groceries cheaper. His proposed method for doing so involves a pilot program of opening a single city-owned grocery store in each borough with controlled prices. He says that if the program goes well, it may be expanded. 5 grocery stores in a city of 8 million one for the 2.7 million residents of Brooklyn, one for the 2.3 million in Queens, will hardly make a difference for the vast majority of New Yorkers. And even if the pilot program is popular, he will have an extremely difficult time convincing the capitalist class to allow him to expand a program of publicly owned stores that compete directly with privately owned monopolies, thus cutting into their profits. Confining himself to the limits of capitalism means accepting extremely limited parameters for pursuing reforms. A communist candidate would also advocate for cheaper groceries, but would explain that capitalist profits and private ownership, nationally and internationally, stand in the way of this. The task would be to mobilize a mass movement demanding the nationalization of the entire food industry to be placed under democratic workers' control. This would need to be linked to a struggle to do the same thing across the entire country. This would be just one of many transitional demands that would connect the pressing needs of the day to a struggle against the capitalist system as a whole. Rent freeze. Another pillar of Zoran's plan for affordability is a call for a rent freeze on rent-stabilized apartments. But the fundamental barrier to affordable housing is capitalist market relations. Communists are not opposed to reforms that might minorly mitigate housing costs, but we must make clear that the only rational plan for public housing can really address the crisis, which is not at all limited to New York, but exists in every single city in America. In fact, recent events in New York show the absurd consequences of, quote, free market housing. In 2019, New York City passed the Housing Stability and Tenant Protection Act, which capped how much landlords could raise the rent for stabilized apartments, among other, quote, tenant-friendly reforms. Landlords responded by warehousing their rent-stabilized units, keeping them off the market. This created a housing shortage, spiking rent prices for non-stabilized units. This shows very clearly why we need a militant, revolutionary struggle to fight the housing crisis. And here there's a quote: "By limiting himself to what is possible under capitalism, Zoran is setting up for failure." When it comes to financing his proposed reforms, Zoran will not enjoy a booming economy with abundant tax revenue. On the contrary, the capitalist system is in deep crisis, saddled with immense public debt, and the ruling class is looking for a way to enact austerity and make cuts to public funding. A reformist program sets out from the assumption that the hardship facing the working class are the result of, quote, poor policy choices. And these problems could be addressed simply by making better ones. But promising substantial improvements in people's quality of life without a program for tackling the structural barriers of capitalism is a recipe for disappointment. This is why Marxists point out that despite the best of intentions, betrayal is inherent in reformism. Not only will his methods fail to deliver reforms for the working class, but they will lead to the discrediting of, quote, socialism by associating it with broken promises. We can be sure that the capitalist press will eagerly seize on each and every opportunity to make this case. The need for class independence. Without a class-independent program or methods, Zoran will inevitably be pulled to the right under the pressure to make deals simply to get things done. This has already happened to a certain extent on a number of issues. For example, in the last weeks of his campaign, he and New York City Comptroller Brad Lander concluded a cross-endorsement agreement, calling for their supporters to rank each other first and second. Zoran's focus on winning the election meant that he tied himself to this Democratic politician, a typical liberal who has nothing to do with socialism. If your aim is simply to get into office, this might be considered, quote, smart politics. If your aim is to help the working class change society, this kind of backroom horse trading is a step in the wrong direction. The success of Zoran's campaign is a clear indication of the anger at the Democratic establishment and a sign of the vast potential that exists for a class-independent party. But by limiting himself to what is possible under capitalism, he is setting himself up for failure. Many of his supporters will learn through this process that enacting change doesn't simply come from calling yourself a socialist or having a nice sounding program on paper. It requires a serious strategy for overthrowing capitalism, which is not as easy as winning an election. A successful struggle against the capitalist class is entirely possible, but it begins with breaking from their parties and fighting to create a party of, by, and for the workers. How would a communist run for office? A genuine communist in office would also face the full might of the bourgeois media. In such a scenario, the role of revolutionary politics would be to hit back and use the sharpening of the class conflict to bring the workers to the understanding that their interests are incompatible with the capitalist system. A communist in office would use this platform to expose the limits of the market and private property, and to tell the truth to the working class that achieving real reforms will take a hard-fought, well-organized struggle against the capitalist class. Such a candidate would be honest about this from the very beginning of the campaign, rather than making promises they could not keep. A communist would clearly clarify that they are running not to tinker with the system, but to help organize a struggle against the ruling class as part of a broader class war to tear the entire system down. That is why class independence is the only possible guiding principle for revolutionary politics. It's not about so-called purity politics or, quote, dogmatism. It's about breaking politically with the capitalists in order to fight them effectively. This means breaking not only with their parties, but with their worldview and the narrow limits of their system. So I'm going to jump from there. This was from earlier this year, in July. And I'm going to jump to the most current edition of the Communist newspaper from October. I wanted to read some from August and September, but you'll have to get one of your own because I'm already at the halfway point for the reading section of my routine. Let's see. Party of billionaires reigns in Zoran. Zoran's primary win in June was a breath of fresh air for millions who hate establishment politics. But by not breaking with Democrats, he has allowed those hated politicians to bring him into their fold. And this is continued on page 6. Democrats and billionaires rein Zoran in. Zoran Mamdani's victory in the Democratic primary for New York City mayor has been a source of optimism and inspiration for people across the country who hate the political establishment. Many Democratic bigwigs panicked, refusing to endorse him. They huddled together in backroom meetings, plotting ways to defeat him. But after a few months, some in the party have changed their tune. Zoran has now been endorsed by a number of widely hated Democrats, including New York Governor Kathy Hochul and even Kamala Harris. Pressure from the class enemy. Despite slanderous attacks in the mainstream press, Zoran is currently leading in the polls, ahead of his deeply discredited, openly pro-capitalist rivals by double digits. Over the last few months, the ruling class has been testing the frontrunner to see how well they'll stand up to pressure. They initially feared Zoran's campaign would embolden a section of the working class. They don't want him creating an expectation of achieving reforms at a time when the crisis of capitalism requires a tax on the working class. But after observing the trajectory of Zoran's campaign, their fears have been relieved. These endorsements come after Zoran backed down in the face of attacks from the capitalist press. At a closed-door meeting with New York City executives, he promised to discourage his supporters from using the slogan, quote, globalize the intifada. He later told the New York Times that he owed cops an apology for saying that NYPD was, quote, racist, anti-queer, and a major threat to public safety. During the 2020 Black Lives Matter movement, he also distanced himself from the Democratic Socialist of America, saying, quote, "My platform is not the same as the National DSA." Zoran also had a series of phone calls and meetings with prominent Democratic politicians, including Hochul, Barack Obama, and Michael Bloomberg. While the content of the discussions remained secret, these meetings must have been, in part, a test of his willingness to adapt to ruling class pressure. Both sides described them as cordial and productive, indicating the attitude that Zoran took in the face of this pressure. Zoran showed Democratic elites that he's willing to make concessions in exchange for gaining or maintaining establishment support. Rather than seeing him as a threat, they now see that he can be pressured and co-opted. At a time when Democrats are weaker than ever, they see it as more useful to make him part of their team in order to give the party a, quote, progressive rebrand. And there's a quote here that says the entire political establishment, including the Democrats, defend the interests of the capitalist class and capitalism as a whole. Unifying our front. Zoran was enthusiastic in response to Hochul's endorsement. "I'm grateful for the governor's support in unifying our party," he said. "Her resolve in standing up to Trump and her focus on making New York affordable. I look forward to the great work we will accomplish together. Our movement is only growing stronger." End quote. This reveals the reason Zoran has made his concessions. He sees the Democratic Party and its politicians as neutral in the fight for socialism. They are, quote, our party and part of our movement, end quote. He doesn't see his campaign as a way to raise working class confidence, consciousness, and unity. Instead, getting elected is the end goal, and support from the likes of Hochul is a useful means to that end. The reality is that the entire political establishment, including the Democrats, defend the interests of the capitalist class and capitalism as a whole. They are enemies of the working class in the fight for socialism. A genuine communist campaign for office would not have the goal of winning at all costs. Our aim would be to sharpen working class consciousness as part of the broader class struggle, even if that meant losing the election. With this in mind, we would maintain class independence by running outside of both capitalist parties and wouldn't crumble when pressured for support from the ruling class. In bed with a strikebreaker. Contrary to Zoran's statement, Hochul's endorsement doesn't make the socialist movement stronger, but weakens it by linking socialism to a staunch enemy of the working class. Commenting on a potential strike of Long Island Railroad workers, Hochul recently said, "We have to get away from the strike language, and the White House and others should be using their power to say, 'You're not allowed to strike, you cannot strike, work it out at the table,'" end quote. Zoran is now tied to this strikebreaker. By hinging his success on support from her and other class enemies, he'll be forced to remain silent or even support reactionary anti-worker policies. But there is another path that Zoran could take if he understood the class line dividing society. He could take a step that would represent a real strengthening of the socialist movement, breaking with the class enemies in the Democratic Party and calling on his legions of supporters to form a party of the working class. An open letter to Zoran volunteers. What I Learned Campaigning for Mayor Johnson in Chicago by Michaela Contreras, Chicago, Illinois. In early 2023, before joining the RCA, I volunteered for Brandon Johnson, a DSA-backed mayoral candidate in Chicago. He promised to end homelessness in Chicago, create affordable housing, reform the police, and increase public transit services. He claimed he'd achieve these reforms by making the wealthy pay their fair share. He even had punchy campaign ads boasting, "I am the only candidate running for mayor who won't raise your property taxes." With no viable alternative, Johnson appealed to the pocketbooks of workers in Chicago. I felt demoralized by the cost of living crisis and channeled that frustration into volunteering. Clipboard in hand, and talking points memorized. I went door knocking and leafleted to convince people to vote for him. Johnson won. Since then, rather than breaking with the ruling class, he has broken one promise after another. The only candidate who won't raise your property taxes, quote, implemented a $300 million property tax hike. Landlords have passed that expense on to renters. Chicago's homeless population has more than tripled to roughly 76,000. Hey, that's an army that could be mobilized. Arm the homeless. Arm the homeless. He vowed to improve and expand public transit, all while lowering fares for low-income residents. Instead, we got a 22% service cut to the L train and 7% service cut to buses, and no fare reduction. Chicago's $770 million deficit now threatens further service cuts and layoffs. Ordinary Chicagoans are bracing for impact. As a result of these betrayals, an M3 Strategies poll this spring showed that Johnson had just 6.6% approval and an 80% disapproval rating. I felt demoralized. It seemed that no politician, not Bernie Sanders, AOC, or Johnson, would be able to help the poor. My experience with Johnson's campaign made me realize that only a socialist revolution would change society for the better. When asked if, quote, standing with billionaires was against his platform, Johnson responded, not at all. Mamdani echoed this. He said he's willing to work with all New Yorkers, including billionaires. A real socialist would understand that working class can only fight for reforms by fighting against billionaires. My demoralization came from politicians who refuse to break with the ruling class politics and parties. What we need is a class-independent party of, by, and for the working class. The program of the RCA doesn't stop at taxing the billionaires. We would expropriate their capital and use it for the benefit of society. Don't wait for demoralization to set in before taking up the banner of revolution. And we have here, break with the Dems, of course. A young worker who volunteered for Zoran recently came up to one of our RCA recruitment tables. And here's a picture of this recruitment table. And I'm pretty sure that this is my roller derby comrade who I chat with on Instagram about revolutionary topics. And this comrade encourages me to push myself. And I encourage you to push yourself and to do better and do more for building up a revolution. This is Quinwheel on Instagram, who I see in the picture here, I'm pretty sure. A young worker who volunteered for Zoran recently came up to one of our RCA recruitment tables. He talked about the cost of living crisis in NYC. The rent is rising like crazy. People are living paycheck to paycheck. Groceries are getting mad expensive, and no one wants to talk about it. That's why Zoran won, I said. He's connecting with working class anger. The Democrats and the establishment are hated, and Zoran is seen as someone willing to stand up to these people. He enthusiastically agreed. The conversation then shifted to the election in November. He was worried. No one actually likes any of the other candidates, but they have a lot of money and powerful backers behind them. He said, I think he will win, but that's when the real problems will start for him. I asked him what he meant. He responded, he needs to fight for the people who made him win. He can't become another politician. I agreed. Hundreds of thousands of workers put their confidence in him and agree with what he is fighting for. The billionaires and their parties will try everything to stop him. They're not scared of Zoran. They're scared of the massive workers behind him. Exactly, he said. They're going to try to pull an AOC with him. I asked, do you think he needs to break with the Democrats? Of course, he exclaimed. We were finishing each other's sentences. Later, during a phone call, he said, capitalism is like an old building. The foundation is crumbling and the ceilings are collapsing over our heads. We keep trying to fix things here and there, but nothing works because the problem is with the foundation. We need to tear the whole building down and build something new with a strong foundation. So I will end there with my reading from a few editions of the communist newspapers. This one is from October of this year. It says, "Billionaires are the enemy." And now we're going to sit and reflect on these ideas while listening to Lenin audiobooks. We're going to meditate for 30 minutes. Then we're going to practice yoga for 30 minutes. And then do martial arts bodyweight exercises for 30 minutes. And you can see from back there that the exercises I do work. It will save your life in real life fights if someone tries to rob you. And you can win gold medals if you train hard. But you have to train constantly, every day. So we're going to listen to some audiobooks while we meditate. We've been listening to a playlist of Lenin. And then we are going to practice yoga and then martial arts. So this is a playlist of 156 long and short audiobooks by Lenin, read by the guy at Socialism for All. I'm just playing his human-read audiobooks from the YouTube channel on my tablet here. Here we go.
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All. It's an audiobook and discussion of More About Nationalism by Lenin from 1914. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe and consider supporting on Patreon at patreon.com/socialismforall. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Put Pravdy number 17, February 20, 1914. Published here according to the text in Put Pravdy. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1972, Moscow, Volume 20. Translated by Bernard Isaacs and the late Joe Feinberg. HTML transcription and markup by R. Cimbala, and it's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, Marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this and thousands of other free Marxist texts. So let's get into the audiobook. In our day, when attempts are being made to stage another Bilas case, the nationalist propaganda could bear more frequent scrutiny. The nature of this propaganda was revealed with striking clarity at the recent Second Congress of Representatives of the All Russia National Association. Quick footnote, what was the Bilas case? Bilas was the name of a Russian Jewish man who was accused of ritual murder and put on a lengthy trial. It's a good example of anti-Jewish discrimination in the Russian Empire, and it was later fictionalized in a book called The Fixer. Continuing. It would be highly erroneous to think that the significance of this propaganda is negligible, inasmuch as this entire All-Russia Association, which was represented only by 21 delegates from all over Russia, is negligible and fictitious, a mere shadow. The All-Russia National Association is insignificant and a shadow, but its propaganda is backed by all the parties of the right and by all the official institutions. Its propaganda is conducted in every village school, every military barrack, and in every church. The following is a press report of a paper read at this Congress on February 2. Quote, Savenko, a member of the Duma, the Russian parliament, read a paper on Mazepism, as the Ukrainian movement is called in the jargon of the nationalists. Savenko expressed the opinion that the separatist tendencies, i.e. for secession from the state, among the Belarusians and the Ukrainians were particularly dangerous. The Ukrainian movement constituted a specially great and real menace to the integrity of Russia. The immediate program of the Ukrainians was federalism and Ukrainian autonomy. The Ukrainians linked their hopes of autonomy with the defeat of Russia in a future war with Austria-Hungary and Germany. On the ruins of Great Russia, an autonomous Poland and an autonomous Ukraine would be founded under the scepter of the Habsburgs and within the boundaries of Austria-Hungary. If the Ukrainians really succeeded in tearing their 30 million away from the Russian people, it would mean the end of the Great Russian Empire. Applause, unquote. Footnote there, what is Mazepism? J.S. Mazepa lived 1644 to 1709. for a number of years conducted treasonable negotiations with the King of Poland and subsequently with the King of Sweden for the secession of the Ukraine from Russia. In 1708, he openly sided with Charles XII. After the defeat of the Swedes at Poltava in 1708, Mazeppa escaped to Turkey with Charles XII. Back to the text. Why is this, quote, federalism no obstacle to the integrity of the United States or of Switzerland? Why is autonomy no obstacle to the integrity of Austria-Hungary? Why has autonomy even cemented the ties between Britain and many of her colonies for a long time to come? Mr. Savenko has presented his case for, quote, nationalism in such a ridiculous light that he has made it extremely easy to refute his ideas. The integrity of Russia, if you please, is, quote, menaced by the autonomy of the Ukraine, whereas the integrity of Austria-Hungary is cemented by universal suffrage and the autonomy of her various regions. Is this not very strange? Will it not occur to those who read and hear this, quote, nationalist propaganda to ask why it is impossible to cement the integrity of Russia by granting autonomy to the Ukraine? By persecuting subject peoples, the landlord and bourgeois nationalists try to split and corrupt the working class, the better to be able to dupe it. The class-conscious workers retaliate by demanding complete equality and unity for the workers of all nationalities in practice. In declaring the Belarusians and Ukrainians to be subject peoples, the nationalist gentry forget to add that the Great Russians, the only non-aliens in Russia, that is to say Russians proper, everyone else in the Russian Empire was known by some other name, White Russians, Little Russians, or something else, but were not considered, quote, Great Russians, constitute only 43% of the population. Hence the subject peoples, in other words, people who are not, quote, Great Russians, are in the majority. How then can the minority keep its hold on the majority if it offers the latter no benefits, the benefits of political freedom, national equality, and local and regional autonomy? By persecuting the Ukrainians and others for their, quote, separatism, for their secessionist strivings, the nationalists are upholding the privilege of the Great Russian landlords and the Great Russian bourgeoisie to have, quote, their own state. The working class is opposed to all privileges. That is why it upholds the right of nations to self-determination. The class-conscious workers do not advocate secession. They know the advantages of large states and the amalgamation of large masses of workers. But large states can be democratic only if there is complete equality among the nations. That equality implies the right to secede. The struggle against national oppression and national privileges is inseparably bound up with the defense of that right. So that's the end of the text. Just to make a few comments here about the end. Lenin talks about this a lot, about how socialists do not advocate secession per se as just like standard course, like the socialist thing is to secede. No. Actually, Lenin says, all other things being equal, it is better to have a larger state where there can be more centralization of industry, more planning, etc., etc. But that is all things being equal. In some cases, secession does make more sense, although it is less preferable from the other lens of having a large state. In other words, Lenin was very much opposed to federalism, which he considered, like sort of the anarchist petty bourgeois vision of things, just have all these tiny little autonomous regions in a federation. That is more the anarchist position as a sort of matter of principle and ideology. Socialists, on the other hand, would prefer, if anarchists prefer that, all things being equal, socialists prefer the opposite, all things being equal. But that said, socialists also uphold the right to secede if that is what the nations want. And as he concludes, the struggle against national oppression and national privileges is inseparably bound up with the defense of that right. All right, we're going to leave it there for now. What do you think? Leave a question or comment in the comments area below. We'll continue the discussion there as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for $2 a month or more, whatever you see fit. Every donation is encouraging, and all the support has allowed me to spend a lot more time creating content for the channel. So thank you all very much. Then after the content is uploaded, engagement counts. Like, share, subscribe. All that stuff helps YouTube to recommend this content to more people and keep the audience expanding at a time when capitalism is going through major crises. And really the quality of the left needs to improve. We need to get back to Marxism, Marxism-Leninism, and studying these texts is a quick and easy route to getting to a more historically literate, theoretically literate, class-conscious place. Thanks again, and we'll catch you in the next video. Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August 2022 edition of Socialism for All, and it's an audiobook and discussion of On the National Pride of the Great Russians by Lenin from 1914. If you like this video, please click like and subscribe, and consider supporting on Patreon. There's a link to Patreon in the video description. So this piece was published in Social Democrat number 35, December 12, 1914, published according to the text in Social Democrat. The source is Lenin Collected Works, Progress Publishers, 1974, Moscow, Volume 21, pages 102 to 106. HTML transcription and markup by D. Walters and R. Symbala. It's in the public domain at the Lenin Internet Archive within the Marxists Internet Archive, marxists.org. Thanks as usual to MIA for hosting this file and thousands of other free Marxist texts. Let's get into the audiobook. What a lot of talk, argument, and vociferation there is nowadays about nationality in the fatherland. Liberal and radical cabinet ministers in Britain, a host of forward-looking journalists in France, who have proved in full agreement with their reactionary colleagues, and a swarm of official cadet and progressive scribblers in Russia, including several Narodniks and, quote, Marxists, all have effusive praise for the liberty and independence of their respective countries, the grandeur of the principle of national independence. Here, one cannot tell where the venal eulogist of the butcher Nicholas Romanov, that is, Nicholas II, the Tsar of Russia, or of the brutal oppressors of Negroes and Indians, ends, and where the common Philistine, who from sheer stupidity or spinelessness drifts with the streams, begins. Nor is that distinction important. We see before us an extensive and very deep ideological trend, whose origins are closely interwoven with the interests of the landowners and the capitalists of the dominant nations. Scores and hundreds of millions are being spent every year for the propaganda of ideas advantageous to those classes. It is a pretty big mill race that takes its waters from all sources, from Menshikov, a chauvinist by conviction, to chauvinists for reason of opportunism or spinelessness, such as Plekhanov and Maslov, Rabanovich and Smirnov, Kropotkin and Burtsev. Let us, great Russian social democrats, also try to define our attitude to this ideological trend. It would be unseemly for us, representatives of a dominant nation in the far east of Europe and a goodly part of Asia, to forget the immense significance of the national question, especially in a country which has rightly been called the prison of the peoples, particularly at a time when, in the far east of Europe and in Asia, capitalism is awakening to life and self-consciousness a number of, quote, new nations, large and small, at a moment when the Tsarist monarchy has called up millions of great Russians and non-Russians, so as to, quote, solve a number of national problems in accordance with the interests of the Council of the United Nobility and of the Guchkovs, Krostovnikovs, Golgorukovs, Cutlers, and Rodachevs. Footnote there, the Council of the United Nobility was a counter-revolutionary landowners organization. It was founded in May 1906, and it exercised considerable influence over the policy of the Tsarist government. Lenin called it the Council of the United Feudalists. Back to the text. Is a sense of national pride alien to us, great Russian class-conscious proletarians? Certainly not. We love our language and our country, and we're doing our very utmost to raise her toiling masses, i.e. 9/10 of her population, to the level of a democratic and socialist consciousness. To us, it is most painful to see and feel the outrages, the oppression and the humiliation our fair country suffers at the hands of the Tsar's butchers, the nobles and the capitalists. We take pride in the resistance to these outrages put up from our midst, from the great Russians, in that midst having produced Radashev, the Decembrists, and the revolutionary commoners of the 70s, in the great Russian working class having created, in 1905, a mighty revolutionary party of the masses, and in the great Russian peasantry having begun to turn towards democracy and set about overthrowing the clergy and the landed proprietors. A couple of footnotes there. A.N. Radashev lived 1749 to 1802, was a Russian writer and revolutionary. In his famous work, A Journey from St. Petersburg to Moscow, he launched the first public attack on serfdom in Russia. By order of Catherine II, he was sentenced to death for the book, but the sentence was commuted to 10 years exile in Siberia. He returned from exile under an amnesty, but committed suicide when faced with the threat of fresh persecution. Lenin regarded Radashev as an outstanding representative of the Russian people. Next, the Decembrists were Russian revolutionary noblemen who, in December 1825, rose in revolt against the autocracy and the serf-owning system. Finally, the commoners, or raznohinci in Russian, were the Russian commoner intellectuals drawn from the petty townsfolk, clergy, the merchant classes, and the peasantry, as distinct from those coming from the nobility. This was the revolutionary commoners of the 70s. Back to the text. We remember that Chernyshevsky, the great Russian Democrat, who dedicated his life to the cause of revolution, said half a century ago, quote, "A wretched nation, a nation of slaves from top to bottom, all slaves." This is a quotation from Chernyshevsky's novel, The Prologue. The overt and covert great Russian slaves, slaves with regard to the Tsarist monarchy, do not like to recall these words. Yet, in our opinion, these were words of genuine love for our country, a love distressed by the absence of a revolutionary spirit in the masses of the great Russian people. There was none of that spirit at the time. There is little of it now, but it already exists. We are full of national pride because the great Russian nation, too, has created a revolutionary class, because it, too, has proved capable of providing mankind with great models of the struggle for freedom and socialism, and not only with great pogroms, rows of gallows, dungeons, great famines, and great servility to priests, czars, landowners, and capitalists. We are full of a sense of national pride, and for that very reason, we particularly hate our slavish past, when the landed nobility led the peasants into war to stifle the freedom of Hungary, Poland, Persia, and China, and our slavish present, when these self-same landed proprietors, aided by the capitalists, are loading us into a war in order to throttle Poland and the Ukraine, crush the democratic movement in Persia and China, and strengthen the gang of Romanovs, Babrinskys, and Purishkeviches, who are a disgrace to our great Russian national dignity. Nobody is to be blamed for being born a slave, but a slave who not only eschews a striving for freedom, but justifies and eulogizes his slavery, e.g. calls the throttling of Poland and the Ukraine, etc., a, quote, defense of the fatherland of the great Russians. Such a slave is a lickspittle and a bore, who arouses a legitimate feeling of indignation, contempt, and loathing. No nation can be free if it oppresses other nations, said Marx and Engels, the greatest representatives of consistent 19th century democracy, who became the teachers of the revolutionary proletariat. And full of a sense of national pride, we great Russian workers want, come what may, a free and independent, a democratic, republican, and proud great Russia, one that will base its relations with its neighbors on the human principle of equality, and not on the feudalist principle of privilege, which is so degrading to a great nation. Just because we want that, we say, it is impossible in the 20th century and in Europe, even in the far east of Europe, to, quote, defend the fatherland otherwise than by using every revolutionary means to combat the monarchy, the landowners, and the capitalists of one's own fatherland, i.e. the worst enemies of our country. We say that the great Russians cannot, quote, defend the fatherland otherwise than by desiring the defeat of Tsarism in any war. This as the lesser evil to 9/10 of the inhabitants of Great Russia. For Tsarism not only oppresses those 9/10 economically and politically, but also demoralizes, degrades, dishonors, and prostitutes them by teaching them to oppress other nations and to cover up this shame with hypocritical and quasi-patriotic phrases. The objection may be advanced that, besides Tsarism and under its wing, another historical force has arisen and become strong, viz. Great Russian capitalism, which is carrying on progressive work by economically centralizing and welding together vast regions. This objection, however, does not excuse, but on the contrary still more condemns our socialist chauvinists, who should be called Tsarist Purishkevich socialists, just as Marx called the Lassallians Royal Prussian socialists. Footnote there, V.M. Purishkevich lived 1870 to 1920, was a big landowner, Black Hundred reactionary, and monarchist, basically a far-right politician. Let us even assume that history will decide in favor of great Russian dominant nation capitalism and against the 101 small nations. That is not impossible, for the entire history of capital is one of violence and plunder, blood and corruption. We do not advocate preserving small nations at all costs, other conditions being equal, emphasis in the text. We are decidedly for centralization and are opposed to the petty bourgeois ideal of federal relationships. Even if our assumption were true, however, it is firstly not our business, or that of Democrats, let alone of socialists, to help Romanov, Babrinsky, Purishkevich throttle the Ukraine, etc. In his own Juncker fashion, Bismarck accomplished a progressive historical task, but he would be a fine, quote, Marxist indeed, who, on such grounds, thought of justifying socialist support for Bismarck. Moreover, Bismarck promoted economic development by bringing together the disunited Germans, who were being oppressed by other nations. The economic prosperity and rapid development of Great Russia, however, require that the country be liberated from Great Russian oppression of other nations. That is the difference that our admirers of the true Russian would be Bismarck's overlook. Secondly, if history were to decide in favor of Great Russian dominant nation capitalism, it follows hence that the socialist role of the Great Russian proletariat as the principal driving force of the communist revolution engendered by capitalism will be all the greater. The proletarian revolution calls for a prolonged education of the workers in the spirit of the fullest national equality and brotherhood. Consequently, the interests of the Great Russian proletariat require that the masses be systematically educated to champion, most resolutely, consistently, boldly, and in a revolutionary manner, complete equality and the right to self-determination for all the nations oppressed by the Great Russians. The interests of the Great Russians' national pride, understood not in the slavish sense, coincide with the socialist interests of the Great Russian and all other proletarians. Our model will always be Marx, who, after living in Britain for decades and becoming half English, demanded freedom and national independence for Ireland in the interests of the socialist movement of the British workers. In the second hypothetical case, we have considered our homegrown social chauvinists, Plekhanov, etc., will prove traitors not only to their own country, the free and democratic Great Russia, but also to the proletarian brotherhood of all the nations of Russia, i.e., to the cause of socialism. That's the end of the audiobook. So this particular piece used to be cited sometimes by people who eventually became what is known as PATSOCs or Patriotic Socialists, a group which was widely eyed with skepticism and suspected of being sort of just reactionaries in disguise, basically trying to hurt the name and therefore the cause of socialism, communism, Marxism in various ways. One of the main arguments was over whether being patriotic in a mega imperialist country like the United States, not a minor imperialist like the greatest exporter and purveyor of violence around the world, whether it was appropriate for socialists within an imperialist country like that to be patriotic, and if so, what does that mean? Well, we remember that Lenin lived in the Russian Empire, which was also an empire back in its day. And we read in a recent text on the question of national policy that the Great Russians, that is to say Russians proper, not the many other ethnicities that existed within the Russian Empire, were actually a minority. They were about 2/5 of the population. And so what Lenin is saying here is Great Russians exist, and from among our ranks we have made some revolutionary contributions. In Lenin's word, we too have proved capable of providing mankind with great models of the struggle for freedom and socialism, and not only with, basically bad examples, great pogroms, rows of gallows, dungeons, etc., etc. So, there should be some pride in that despite it all, the Great Russians have been able to make some contributions to revolutionary history of humanity. Wonderful. And also that the Great Russian socialists should continue striving for an internationalist socialism, which places the Great Russian division of it not on a pedestal, not with privilege in relation to any other group, but alongside everything else in freedom and voluntary relationships. That's all great. Does this amount to what we would understand as patriotism today? I would say no. I would say that largely when you ask somebody about patriotism, it is understood by the average person in the context of basically what we would call bourgeois nationalism. If you ask the average US American if they're patriotic, that is generally how the question is understood, not in terms of like, oh yeah, I'm patriotic because we had a strong labor movement. That's not usually what comes up. We covered this in depth in an earlier video, why did Trump win the working class? Short answer, Trump didn't. That's what the video was about. But we also looked at polls that the more conservative a person is, the more likely to say that they are patriotic. So obviously what Lenin is talking about here, like having some pride in your people because despite it all, you made some revolutionary socialist contributions, is quite different from what the right-wingers and Republicans are answering when they say, yes, I am patriotic. That's clearly something else, okay? I think that is pretty common sense for most people, but we had to have this whole discussion for, I don't know, 6-8 months online. So Lenin closes by saying, in the second hypothetical case, we have considered our own homegrown socialist chauvinists, Plekhanov, etc., who will prove traitors not only to their own country, a free and democratic Great Russia, but also to the proletarian brotherhood of all the nations of Russia, i.e. to the cause of socialism. So here Lenin's predicting that those, quote, socialists who start to involve themselves in projects which dabble in bourgeois nationalism in some way, try to sell it to their base and so on, will end up being traitors to socialism. Well, what have we seen out of the PATSOK movement in the last, I don't know, 6 months since they've been kind of outed? Well, all kinds of just completely insane right-wing stuff, more full-on just fascism. You know, it's taking the mask off. I think that it's really burning out at this point. Thankfully, that was kind of a really just difficult, distracting period having to deal with that. But, you know, these are some of the growing pains that a socialist movement has to go through, casting off imposters and resolving those kinds of ideological struggles in favor of the proletariat, to stay on course and not let ourselves get taken off. So that's the good news. I think that we're really pretty much through that struggle at this point. And I think that the last thing that sort of bears mentioning on this before we wrap it up is the way that the PATSOKs in this debate were trying to misrepresent the pushback that they were getting to the nationalism that they were pushing. You know, the objections to it were very clear-cut. The United States is an empire. The U.S. flag means death, misery, and oppression to most countries around the world. Any socialist movement would be looking for radical change in that regard, not to wrap itself in that flag. And, you know, rather than just saying, look, yeah, all that's fine, you know, the flag is the flag of the bourgeoisie, etc., we're not trying to preserve that for all time. All we're saying is that we too can do revolutionary things eventually, and when we do them, we should be proud of them. But, you know, of course, we're doing those things against everything represented by that flag, and over the wishes of the people who look to that flag as something positive that they're trying to hang on to. I mean, it kind of just goes into almost like right-wing 1776 conspiracy theories of like, the United States is a great country, and the only reason it became an empire is like some outside conspiratorial forces befouled it. And, you know, it's just, it goes down this whole road. Everything that we've seen, the right-wing filth that we've seen from the PATSOKs ever since, you know, people who did not take their side during that initial rift when it formed, I believe last fall, mainly during that land back debate. I think that those who had the instinct that they were going in a nationalistic direction and not just having, you know, pride of the working class kind of thing, well, those instincts were correct, and we see now, you know, almost a full year later where we ended up. Anyway, I'm sure that there's more that can be said. A lot's been said already. I think I've said enough. What do you think? Leave a question or comment below. We'll continue the discussion in the comment section as always. Otherwise, thanks for listening. And thanks to the current patrons whose names are on the screen. If you'd like to get your name on the screen, we don't run ads or sponsorships on this channel, so that Patreon support is important. It's allowed me to spend a lot more time on this channel than I would have been able to do otherwise. Head to patreon.com/socialismforall. You can sign up for as little as $2 a month or more. whatever you see fit. Every donation.
I just wanted to note that
Hey, welcome to Socialism for All. This file is being recorded for the August.
one of the things he said there was that basically there's nothing more contemptible than a slave who is grateful for their enslavement. And that is a really good one-liner to take from that last audiobook.
Materialism was predominantly mechanical, failing to take account of the late with this materialist philosophy of Marx's. Most reactionary, subsequently confirmed by all proletarian and an article on the condition of peasant wine growers in the trend became more and more pronounced on called Rheinische Zeitung. The first issue appeared developed his materialist theory in a number of historical works, devoting himself mainly to a study of political economy. Marx revolutionized science, see the Marxist doctrine below, in his Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy, 1859, and Capital, Volume 1, 1867. The revival of the democratic movements in the late 50s and in the 60s recalled Marx to practical activity. In 1864, September 28th, the International Working Men's Association, the celebrated First International, was founded in London. Marx was the heart and soul of this organization and author of its first address, and of a host of resolutions, declarations, and manifestos. In uniting the labor movement of various forms of non-proletarian pre-Marxist socialism, Mazzini, Proudhon, Bakunin, liberal trade unionism in Britain, Lassallean vacillations to the right in Germany, and in combating the theories of all these sects and schools, Marx hammered out a uniform tactic for the proletarian struggle of the working in the various countries. Following the downfall of the Paris Commune, 1871, of which gave such a profound, clear-cut, brilliant, effective, and revolutionary analysis, the Civil War in France, 1871, and the Bakunin-caused cleavage in the International, the latter organization could no longer exist in Europe. After the Hague Congress of the International, 1872, Marx had the General Council of the International had played its historical part, and now made way for a period of a far greater development of the labor movement in all countries in the world, a period in which the movement grew in scope and mass socialist working class parties and individual national states were formed. Marx's health was undermined by his strenuous work in the International and his still more strenuous theoretical occupations. He continued work on the refashioning of political economy and on the completion of Capital, for which he collected a mass of new material and studied a number of languages, Russian for instance. However, ill health prevented him from completing Capital. His wife died on December 2nd, 1881, and on March 14th, 1883, Marx passed away peacefully in his armchair. He lies buried next to his wife at Highgate Cemetery in London. Of Marx's children, some died in childhood in London when the family were living in destitute circumstances. 3 daughters married English and French socialists, Eleanor Aveling, Laura Lafargue, and Jenny Longuet. The latter's son is a member of the French Socialist Party. Section 2, the Marxist Doctrine. Marxism is the system of Marx's views and teachings. Marx was the genius who continued and consummated the 3 main ideological currents of the 19th century, as represented by the 3 most advanced countries of humankind: classical German philosophy, classical English political economy, and French socialism combined with French revolutionary doctrines in general. Acknowledged even by his opponents, the remarkable consistency and integrity of Marx's views, whose totality constitutes modern materialism and modern scientific socialism, as the theory and program of the working class movement in all the civilized countries of the world, make it incumbent on us to present a brief outline of his world conception in general, prior to giving an exposition of the principal content of Marxism, namely, Marx's economic doctrine. Philosophical materialism.
Beginning with the years 1844 to 45, when his views took shape, Marx was a materialist, and especially a follower of Ludwig Feuerbach, whose weak point he subsequently saw only in his materialism being insufficiently consistent and comprehensive. To Marx, Feuerbach's historic and epoch-making significance lay in his having resolutely broken with Hegel's idealism and in his proclamation of materialism, which already, quote, in the 18th century, particularly French materialism, was not only a struggle against the existing political institutions and against religion and theology, but also against all metaphysics, end quote, in the sense of, quote, drunken speculation, end quote, as distinct from, quote, sober philosophy, end quote. The Holy Family in Literature Nachlass. To Hegel, wrote Marx, the process of thinking, which under the name of the idea, he even transforms into an independent subject, is to the demiurgos, the creator or the maker of the real world. With me, on the contrary, this ideal is nothing else than the material world reflected by the human mind and translated into forms of thought. Capital, Volume 1, afterward to the second edition. In full conformity with this materialist philosophy of Marx's, and expounding it, Friedrich Engels wrote in Anti-Durang, read by Marx in the manuscript, quote, "The real unity of the world consists in its materiality, and this is proved by a long and wearisome development of philosophy and natural science. Motion is the mode of existence of matter. Never anywhere has there been matter without motion, or motion without matter, nor can there be. But if the question is raised, what thought and consciousness really are, and where they come from, it becomes apparent that they are products of the human brain, and that man himself is a product of nature, which has developed in and along with its environment. Hence it is self-evident that the products of the human brain, being in the last analysis also products of nature, do not contradict the rest of nature's interconnections, but are in correspondence with them." Hegel was an idealist. That is to say, the thoughts within his mind were to him not the more or less abstract images or reflections. Engels sometimes speaks of imprints, as this word, of real things and processes, but on the contrary, things in their development were to him only the images made real of the, quote, idea existing somewhere or other before the world existed. In his Ludwig Feuerbach, which expounded his own and Marx's views on Feuerbach's philosophy, and was sent to the printers after he had reread an old manuscript Marx and himself had written in 1844 to 45 on Hegel, Feuerbach, and the materialist conception of history, Engels wrote, quote, "The great basic question to all of philosophy, especially of more recent philosophy, is the relation of thinking and being, spirit to nature. Which is primary, spirit or nature? The answers which the philosophers gave to this question split them into two great camps. Those who asserted the primary of spirit to nature, and therefore, in the last instance, assumed world creation in some form or another, comprised the camp of idealism. The others, who regarded nature as primary, belonged to the various schools of materialism." End quote. Any other use of the concepts of philosophical idealism and materialism leads only to confusion. Marx decidedly rejected not only idealism, which is always linked in one way or another with religion, but also the views, especially widespread in our day, of human cant, agnosticism, criticism, and positivism in their various forms. He considered that philosophy a reactionary concession to idealism, and at best a, quote, shamefaced way of surreptitiously accepting materialism while denying it before the world, end quote. On this question, see, besides the works by Marx and Engels mentioned above, a letter Marx wrote to Engels on December 12, 1868, in which, referring to an utterance by the naturalist Thomas Huxley, which was, quote, more materialistic, end quote, than usual, and to his recognition that, quote, as long as we actually observe and think, we cannot possibly get away from materialism, end quote, Marx reproached Huxley for leaving a, quote, loophole, end quote, for agnosticism, for Humism. It is particularly important to note Marx's view on the relation between freedom and necessity. Quote, freedom is the appreciation of necessity. Necessity is blind only insofar as it is not understood. Engels and Anti-Durang. This means recognition of the rule of objective laws in nature and of the dialectical transformation of necessity into freedom in the same manner as the transformation of the uncognized but cognizable thing in itself into the thing for us, of the essence of things into phenomena. Marx and Engels considered that the old materialism, including that of Feuerbach, and still more the vulgar materialism of Buchner, Vogt, and Molschat, contained the following major shortcomings. 1. This materialism was predominantly mechanical, failing to take account of the latest developments in chemistry and biology. Today it would be necessary to add the electrical theory of matter. 2. The old materialism was non-historical and non-dialectical, or metaphysical in the meaning of anti-dialectical, and did not adhere consistently and comprehensively to the standpoint of development. And 3, it regarded the, quote, human essence in the abstract, not as the, quote, complex of all concretely and historically determined social relations, and therefore merely interpreted the world, whereas it was a question of changing it, i.e., it did not understand the importance of, quote, revolutionary practical activity. Dialectics. As the most comprehensive and profound doctrine of development and the richest in content, Hegelian dialectics was considered by Marx and Engels the greatest achievement of classical German philosophy. They thought that any other formulation of the principle of development, of evolution, was one-sided and poor in content and could only distort and mutilate the actual course of development, which often proceeds by leaps and via catastrophes and revolutions in nature and in society. Quote, Marx and I were pretty well the only people to rescue conscious dialectics from the destruction of idealism, including Hegelianism, and apply it in the materialist conception of nature. Nature is the proof of dialectics, and it must be said for modern natural science that it has furnished extremely rich, and this was written before the discovery of radium, electrons, the transmutation of elements, etc., and in daily increasing materials for this test, and has thus proved that in the last analysis, nature's process is dialectical and not metaphysical. Quote, the great basic thought, Engels writes, that the world is not to be comprehended as a complex of ready-made things, but as a complex of processes in which the things apparently stable no less than their mind images in our heads, the concepts, go through an uninterrupted change of coming into being and passing away. This great fundamental thought has, especially since the time of Hegel, so thoroughly permeated ordinary consciousness that in this generality it is now scarcely ever contradicted. But to acknowledge this fundamental thought in words and to apply it in reality in detail to each domain of investigation are two different things. For dialectical philosophy, nothing is final, absolute, sacred. It reveals the transitory character of everything and in everything. Nothing can endure before it except the uninterrupted process of becoming and of passing away, of endless ascendancy from the lower to the higher. And dialectical philosophy itself is nothing more than the mere reflection of this process in the thinking brain, end quote. Thus, according to Marx, dialectics is, quote, the science of the general laws of motion, both of the external world and of human thought, end quote. This revolutionary aspect of Hegel's philosophy was adopted and developed by Marx. Dialectical materialism, quote, does not need any philosophy standing above the other sciences, end quote. From previous philosophy there remains, quote, the science of thought and its laws, formal logic and dialectics, end quote. Dialectics, as understood by Marx and also in conformity with Hegel, includes what is now called the theory of knowledge or epistemology, studying and generalizing the original and development of knowledge, the transition from non-knowledge to knowledge. In our times, the idea of development, of evolution, has almost completely penetrated social consciousness, only in other ways and not through Hegelian philosophy. Still, this idea, as formulated by Marx and Engels on the basis of Hegel's philosophy, is far more comprehensive and far richer in content than the current idea of evolution is. A development that repeats, as it were, stages that have already been passed, but repeats them in a different way, on a higher basis, quote, the negation of the negation.
a development, so to speak, that proceeds in spirals, not in a straight line, a development by leaps, catastrophes, and revolutions, quote, breaks in continuity, end quote, the transformation of quantity into quality, inner impulses towards development, imparted by the contradiction and conflict of the various forces and tendencies acting on a given body, or within a given phenomenon, or within a given society. The interdependence and the closest and indissoluble connection between all aspects of any phenomenon, history constantly revealing ever new aspects. A connection that provides a uniform and universal process of motion, one that follows definite laws. These are some of the features of dialectics as a doctrine of development that is richer than the conventional one. See Marx's letter to Engels of January 8, 1868, in which he ridicules Stein's, quote, wooden trichotomies, which would be absurd to confuse with materialist dialectics. The materialist conception of history. A realization of the inconsistency, incompleteness, and one-sidedness of the old materialism convinced Marx of the necessity of, quote, bringing the science of society into harmony with the materialist foundation and of reconstructing it thereupon, end quote. Since materialism in general explains consciousness as the outcome of being and not conversely, then materialism, as applied to the social life of mankind, has to explain social consciousness as the outcome of social being. Quote, technology, Marx writes in Capital, Volume 1, discloses humanity's mode of dealing with nature, the immediate process of production by which we sustain our life, and thereby also lays bare the mode of formation of our social relations, and of the mental conceptions that flow from them. In the preface to his contribution to the critique of political economy, Marx gives an integral formulation of the fundamental principles of materialism as applied to human society and its history in the following words, quote, in the social production of our lives, people enter into definite relations that are indispensable and independent of our will, relations of production which correspond to a definite stage of development of their material productive forces. The sum total of these relations of production constitutes the economic structure of society, the real foundation, on which rises a legal and political superstructure, and to which correspond definite forms of social consciousness. The mode of production of material life conditions the social, political, and intellectual life process in general. It is not the consciousness of people that determines our being, but on the contrary, our social being that determines our consciousness. At a certain stage of their development, the material productive forces of society come in conflict with the existing relations of production, or what is but a legal expression for the same thing, with the property relations within which they have been at work hitherto. From forms of development of the productive forces, these relations turn into their fetters. Then begins an epoch of social revolution. With the change of the economic foundation, the entire immense superstructure is more or less rapidly transformed. In considering such transformations, a distinction should always be made between the material transformation of the economic conditions of production, which can be determined with the precision of natural science, and the legal, political, religious, aesthetic, or philosophic, in short, ideological forms, in which people become conscious of this conflict and fight it out. Quote, just as our opinion of an individual is not based on what they think of themselves, so we cannot judge of such a period of transformation by its own consciousness. On the contrary, this consciousness must be explained rather from the contradictions of material life, from the existing conflict between the social productive forces and the relations of production. In broad outlines, Asiatic, ancient, feudal, and modern bourgeois modes of production can be designated as successive eras in the economic formation of society, end quote. Marx's brief formulation in a letter to Engels dated July 7, 1866, quote, our theory that the organization of labor is determined by the means of production. The discovery of the materialist conception of history, or more correctly, the consistent continuation and extension of materialism into the domain of social phenomena, removed the two chief shortcomings in earlier historical theories. In the first place, the latter at best examined only the ideological motives in the historical activities of human beings without investigating the origins of these motives, or ascertaining the objective laws governing the development of the system of social relations, or seeing the roots of these relations in the degree of development reached by material production. In the second place, the earlier theories did not embrace the activities of the masses of the population, whereas historical materialism made it possible for the first time to study with scientific accuracy the social conditions of the life of the masses and the changes in those conditions. At best, pre-Marxist sociology and historiography brought forth an accumulation of raw facts, collected at random, and a description of individual aspects of the historical process. By examining the totality of opposing tendencies, by reducing them to precisely definable conditions of life and production of the various classes of individual aspects of the historical process, by examining the choice of a particular dominant idea or in its interpretation, and by revealing that, without exception, all ideas and all the various tendencies stem from the condition of the material forces of production, Marxism indicated the way to an all-embracing and comprehensive study of the process of the rise, development, and decline of socioeconomic systems. People make their own history, but what determines the motives of people, of the mass of people, i.e., what is the sum total of all these clashes in the mass of human societies? What are the objective conditions of production of material life that form the basis of all man's historical activity? What is the law of development of these conditions? To all these, Marx drew attention and indicated the way to a scientific study of history as a single process which, with all its immense variety and contradictoriness, is governed by definite laws. The class struggle. It is common knowledge that, in any given society, the striving of some of its members conflict with the strivings of others, that social life is full of contradictions, and that history reveals a struggle between nations and societies, as well as within nations and societies, and, besides, an alternation of periods of revolution and reaction, peace and war, stagnation and rapid progress or decline. Marxism has provided the guidance, i.e. the theory of the class struggle, for the discovery of the laws governing this seeming maze and chaos. It is only a study of the sum of the strivings of all the members of a given society or group of societies that can lead to a scientific definition of the result of those strivings. Now the conflicting strivings stem from the difference in the position and mode of life of the classes into which each society is divided. Quote, "The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles," end quote, Marx wrote in the Communist Manifesto, with the exception of the history of the primitive community, Engels added subsequently. Quote, "Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guildmaster and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed, stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on an uninterrupted, now hidden, now open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstruction of society at large or in the common ruin of those contending classes. The modern bourgeois society that has sprouted from the ruins of feudal society has not done away with class antagonisms. It has but established new classes, new conditions of oppression, new forms of struggle in place of the old ones. Our epoch, the epoch of the bourgeoisie, possesses, however, this distinctive feature. It has simplified class antagonisms. Society as a whole is more and more splitting up into two great hostile camps, into two great classes directly facing each other, bourgeoisie and proletariat. Ever since the Great French Revolution, European history has, in a number of countries, tellingly revealed what actually lies at the bottom of events, the struggle of classes. The Restoration period in France already produced a number of historians, Thierry, Guizot, Mignet, and Thiers, who, in summing up what was taking place, were obliged to admit that the class struggle was taking place, were obligated to admit that the class struggle was key to all of French history. The modern period, that of complete victory of the bourgeoisie, representative institutions, extensive, if not universal suffrage, a cheap daily press that is widely circulated among the masses, etc., a period of powerful and ever-expanding unions of workers and unions of employers, etc., has shown even more strikingly though sometimes in a very one-sided, quote, peaceful and, quote, constitutional form, the class struggle as the mainspring of events. The following passage from Marx's Communist Manifesto will show us what Marx demanded of social science as regards an objective analysis of the position in each class in modern society, with reference to an analysis of each class's conditions of development. Quote, "Of all the classes that stand face to face with the bourgeoisie today, the proletariat alone is a really revolutionary class. The other classes decay and finally disappear in the face of modern industry. The proletariat is its special and essential product. The lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, all these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as fractions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat." In a number of historical works, Marx gave brilliant and profound examples of materialist historiography, of an analysis of the position of each individual class, and sometimes of various groups or strata within a class, showing plainly why and how, quote, "every class struggle is a political struggle." The above quoted passage is an illustration of what a complex network of social relations and transitional stages from one class to another, from the past to the future, was analyzed by Marx so as to determine the resultant of historical development. Marx's economic doctrine is the most profound, comprehensive, and detailed confirmation and application of his theory. Section 3, Marx's economic doctrine. Quote, "It is the ultimate aim of this work to lay bare the economic law of motion of modern society, i.e. capitalist bourgeois society," says Marx in the preface to Capital. "An investigation into the relations of production in a given historically defined society, in their inception, development, and decline, such is the content of Marx's economic doctrine. In capitalist society, the production of commodities is predominant, and Marx's analysis therefore begins with an analysis of commodity. Value. A commodity is, in the first place, a thing that satisfies a human want. In the second place, it is a thing that can be exchanged for another thing. Utility of a thing makes it a use value. Exchange value, or simply value, is first of all the ratio, the proportion, in which a certain number of use values of one kind can be exchanged for a certain number of use values of another kind. Daily experience shows us that million upon millions of such exchanges are constantly equating with one another every kind of use value, even the most diverse and incomparable. Now, what is there in common between these various things? Things constantly equated with one another in a definite system of social relations. Their common feature is that they are all products of labor. In exchanging products, people equate the most diverse kinds of labor. The production of commodities is a system of social relations in which individual producers create diverse products, the social division of labor, and in which all these products are equated with one another in the process of exchange. Consequently, what is common to all commodities is not the concrete labor of a definite branch of production, not labor of one particular kind, but abstract human labor in general. All the labor power of a given society, as represented in the sum total of the values of all commodities, is one and the same human labor power. Thousands upon thousands of millions of acts of exchange prove this. Consequently, each particular commodity represents only a certain share of the socially necessary labor time. The magnitude of value is determined by the amount of socially necessary labor, or by the labor time that is socially necessary for the production of a given commodity or a given use value. Quote, "Whenever, by an exchange, we equate as values our different products, by that very act we also equate as human labor the different kind of labor that was expended upon them. We're not aware of this, nevertheless we do it." That's from Capital. As one of the earlier economists said, Value is a relation between two persons. Only he should have added, a relation concealed beneath a material wrapping. We can understand what value is only when we consider it from the standpoint of the system of social relations of production in a particular historical type of society, moreover, or relations that manifest themselves in the mass phenomenon of exchange, a phenomenon which repeats itself thousands upon thousands of times. As values, all commodities are only definite masses of congealed labor time. That is from a contribution to the critique of political economy. After making a detailed analysis of the twofold character of the labor incorporated in commodities, Marx goes on to analyze the form of value and money. Here, Marx's main task is to study the origin of the money form of value, to study the historical process of the development of exchange, beginning with individual and incidental acts of exchange, the, quote, elementary or accidental form of value, end quote, in which a given quantity of one commodity is exchanged for a different quantity of another, passing on to the universal form of value, in which a number of different commodities are exchanged for one and the same particular commodity, and ending with the money form of value, when gold becomes that particular commodity, the universal equivalent. As the highest product of the development of exchange and commodity production, money masks, conceals, the social character of all individual labor, the social link between individual producers united by the market. Marx analyzes the various functions of money in very great detail. It is important to note here in particular, as in the opening chapters of Capital in general, that what seems to be an abstract and at times purely deductive mode of exposition deals in reality with a gigantic collection of factual material on the history of the development of exchange and commodity production. Quote, if we consider money, its existence implies a definite stage in the exchange of commodities, the particular functions of money, which it performs either as the mere equivalent of commodities or as means of circulation or means of payment, as hoard or as universal money, point according to the extent and relative preponderance of the one function or the other to very different stages in the process of social production. Capital. Surplus value. At a certain stage in the development of commodity production, money becomes transformed into capital. The formula of commodity circulation was CMC, commodity, money, commodity, i.e. the sale of one commodity for the purpose of buying another. The general formula of capital, on the contrary, is MCN, the purchase for the purpose of selling at a profit. The increase over the original value of the money that is put into circulation is called by Marx surplus value. The fact of this, quote, growth of money in capitalist circulation is common knowledge. Indeed, it is this, quote, growth which transforms money into capital as a special and historically determined social relation of production. Surplus value cannot arise out of commodity circulation, for the latter knows only the exchange of equivalents. Neither can it arise out of price increases, for the mutual losses and gains of buyers and sellers would equalize one another. Whereas what we have here is not an individual phenomenon, but a mass, average, and social phenomenon. To obtain surplus value, the owner of money, quote, must find in the market a commodity whose use value possesses the peculiar property of being a source of value. A commodity whose process of consumption is at the same time a process of the creation of value. Such a commodity exists: human labor power. Its consumption is labor, and labor creates value. The owner of money buys labor power at its value, which, like the value of every other commodity, is determined by the socially necessary labor time requisite for its production, i.e. the cost of maintaining the worker and his family. Having bought enough labor power, the owner of money is entitled to use it, that is, to set it to work for a whole day, 12 hours, let's say. Yet, in the course of 6 hours, quote, necessary labor time, the worker produces product sufficient to cover the cost of his own maintenance, In the course of the next 6 hours, surplus labor time, the worker creates surplus product or surplus value for which the capitalist does not pay the worker. Therefore, from the standpoint of the process of production, two parts must be distinguished in capital. Constant capital, which is expended on means of production, machinery, tools, raw materials, etc., whose value without any change is transferred immediately or part by part to the finished product. Secondly, variable capital, which is expended on labor power. The value of this latter capital is not invariable, but grows in the labor process, creating surplus value. Therefore, to express the degree of capital's exploitation of labor power, surplus must be compared not with the entire capital, but only with variable capital. Thus, in the example just given, the rate of surplus value, as Marx calls this ratio, will be 6 to 6, i.e. 100%. There were two historical prerequisites for capital to arise. First, the accumulation of certain sums of money in the hands of individuals under conditions of a relatively high level of development of community production in general. Secondly, the existence of a worker who is free in a double sense, free of all constraint or restriction on the scale of their labor power, and free from the land and all means of production in general. A free and unattached laborer, a proletarian, who cannot subsist except by selling their labor power. There are two main ways of increasing surplus value: lengthening the working day, quote, absolute surplus value, and reducing the necessary working day, quote, relative surplus value. In analyzing the former, Marx gives a most impressive picture of the struggle of the working class for a shorter working day, and of interference by the state authority to lengthen the working day from the 14th century to the 17th, and then to reduce it, factory legislation in the 19th century. Since the appearance of capital, the history of the working class movement in all civilized countries of the world has provided a wealth of new facts amplifying this picture, and that's since the appearance of Capital, the book. Analyzing the production of relative surplus value, Marx investigates the three fundamental historical stages in capitalism's increase of the productivity of labor. 1, simple cooperation. 2, the division of labor and manufacture. And 3, machinery and large-scale industry. How profoundly Marx has here revealed the basic and typical features of capitalist development is shown incidentally by the fact that investigations into the handicraft industries in Russia furnish abundant material illustrating the first two of the mentioned stages. The revolutionizing effect of large-scale machine industry, as described by Marx in 1867, has revealed itself in a number of, quote, new countries, Russia, Japan, etc., in the course of the half-century that since has elapsed. To continue, new and important in the highest degree is Marx's analysis of the accumulation of capital, i.e. the transformation of a part of surplus value into capital, and its use not for satisfying the personal needs or whims of the capitalist, but for new production. Marx revealed the error made by all earlier classical political economists, beginning with Adam Smith, who assumed that the entire surplus value which is transformed into capital goes to form variable capital. In actual fact, it is divided into means of production and variable capital. Of tremendous importance to the process of development of capitalism and its transformation into socialism is the more rapid growth of the constant capital share of the total capital as compared with the variable capital share. By speeding up the supplanting of workers by machinery, and by creating wealth at one extreme and poverty at the other, the accumulation of capital also gives rise to what is called, quote, the reserve army of labor, to the, quote, relative surplus of workers, or, quote, capitalist overpopulation, which assumes the most diverse forms and enables capital to expand production extremely rapidly. In conjunction with credit facilities and the accumulation of capital in the form of means of production, this incidentally is the key to an understanding of the crises of overproduction, which occur periodically in capitalist countries, at first at an average of every 10 years, and later at more lengthy and less definite intervals. From the accumulation of capital under capitalism, we should distinguish what is known as primitive accumulation, the forcible divorcement of the worker from the means of production, the driving of the peasant off the land, the stealing of communal lands, the system of colonies and national debts, protective tariffs, and the like. Quote, primitive accumulation creates the, quote, free proletarian at one extreme and the owner of money, the capitalist, at the other. The, quote, historical tendency of capitalist accumulation is described by Marx in the following celebrated words. Quote, the expropriation of the immediate producers is accomplished with merciless vandalism, and under the stimulus of passions the most infamous, the most sordid, the pettiest, the most meanly odious. Self-earned private property of the peasant and handicraftsman, that is based, so to say, on the fusing together of the isolated, independent laboring individual with the conditions of their labor, is supplanted by capitalistic private property, which rests on exploitation of the nominally free labor of others. That which is now to be expropriated is no longer the laborer working for himself, but the capitalist exploiting many laborers. This expropriation is accomplished by the action of the immanent laws of capitalistic production itself, by the centralization of capital. One capitalist always kills many. Hand in hand with the centralization or this expropriation of many capitalists by few, develop, on an ever-extending scale, the cooperative form of the labor process, the conscious technical application of science, the methodical cultivation of the soil, the transformation of the instruments of labor into instruments of labor only usable in common, the economizing of all means of production by their use as the means of production of combined socialized labor, the entanglement of all people in the net of the world market, and with this the international character of the capitalistic regime. Along with the constantly diminishing number of the magnates of capital who usurp and monopolize all advantages of this process of transformation, grows the mass of misery, oppression, slavery, degradation, exploitation. But with this too grows the revolt of the working class, a class always increasing in numbers and disciplined, united, organized by the very mechanism of the process of capitalist production itself. The monopoly of capital becomes a fetter upon the mode of production, which has sprung up and flourished along with and under it. Centralization of the means of production and socialization of labor at last reaches a point where they become incompatible with their capitalist integument. This integument is burst asunder, the knell of capitalist private property sound. The expropriators are expropriated, end quote, Capital, Volume 1. Also new and important in the highest degree is the analysis Marx gives in Volume 2 of Capital of the reproduction of aggregate social capital. Here too, Marx deals not with an individual phenomenon, but with a mass phenomenon. Not with a fractional part of the economy of society, but with that economy as a whole. Correcting the aforementioned error of the classical economists, Marx divides the whole of social production into two big sections. One, production of the means of production, and two, production of articles of consumption, and examines in detail, with numerical examples, the circulation of the aggregate social capital, both when reproduced in its former dimension and in the case of accumulation. Volume 3 of Capital solves the problem of how the average rate of profit is formed on the basis of the law of value. This immense stride forward, made by economic science in the person of Marx, consists in his having conducted an analysis, from the standpoint of mass economic phenomena, of the social economy as a whole, not from the standpoint of individual cases or of the external and superficial aspects of competition, to which vulgar political economy and the modern, quote, theory of marginal utility frequently restrict themselves. Marx first analyzes the origin of surplus value, and then goes on to consider its division to profit, interest, and ground rent. Profit is the ratio between surplus value and the total capital invested in an undertaking. Capital with a, quote, high organic composition, i.e. with a preponderance of constant capital over variable capital in excess of the social average, yields a rate of profit below the average. Capital with a, quote, low organic composition yields a rate of profit above the average. Competition among capitalists and their freedom to transfer their capital from one branch to another will in both cases reduce the rate of profit to the average. The sum total of the values of all the commodities in a given society coincides with the sum total of the prices of the commodities, but in individual undertakings and branches of production, as a result of competition, commodities are sold not at their values at the prices of production, or production prices, which are equal to the capital expended plus the average profit. In this way, the well-known and indisputable fact of the divergence between prices and values and of the equalization of profits is fully explained by Marx on the basis of law of value, since the sum total of values of all commodities coincides with the sum total of prices. However, the equating of social value to individual prices does not take place simply and directly, but in a very complex way. It is quite natural that in a society of separate producers of commodities who are united only by the market, a conformity to law can only be an average social mass manifestation with individual deviations in either direction mutually compensating one another. A rise in the productivity of labor implies a more rapid growth of constant capital as compared with variable capital. Inasmuch as surplus value is a function of variable capital alone, it is obvious that the rate of profit, the ratio of surplus value to the whole capital, not to its variable part alone, tends to fall. This makes a detailed analysis of this tendency and of a number of circumstances that conceal or counteract it. Without pausing to deal with the extremely interesting sections of Volume 3 of Capital, Volume 1 devoted to usurer's capital, commercial capital, and money capital, we must pass on to the most important section, the theory of ground rent. Since the area of land is limited, and in capitalist countries the land is all held by individual private owners, the price of production of agricultural products is determined by the cost of production, not on soil of average quality, but on the worst soil, not under average conditions, but under the worst conditions of delivery of produce to the market. The difference between this price and the price of production on better soil, or in better conditions, constitutes differential rent. Analyzing this in detail and showing how it arises out of the difference in fertility of different plots of land and out of the difference in the amount of capital invested in land, Marx fully reveals, see also Theories of Surplus Value, in which the criticism of Rodbertus is most noteworthy. The error of Ricardo, who considered that differential rent is derived only when there is a successive transition from better land to worse. On the contrary, there may be inverse transitions. Land may pass from one category into others, owing to advances in agricultural techniques, the growth of towns, and so on. And the notorious, quote, law of diminishing returns, which charges nature with the defects, limitations, and contradictions of capitalism, is profoundly erroneous. Furthermore, the equalization of profit in all branches of industry and the national economy in general presupposes complete freedom of competition and the free flow of capital from one branch to another. However, the private ownership of land creates monopoly, which hinders that free flow. Because of that monopoly, the product of agriculture, where a lower organic composition of capital obtains, and so consequently an individually higher rate of profit, do not enter into the quite free process of the equalization of the rate of profit. As a monopolist, the landowner can keep the price above the average, and this monopoly price gives rise to an absolute rent. Differential rent cannot be done away with under capitalism, but absolute rent can. For instance, by the nationalization of the land, by making it state property. That would undermine the monopoly of private landowners and would mean the sole, consistent, and full operation of freedom of competition in agriculture. That is why, as Marx points out, bourgeois radicals have again and again in the course of history advanced this progressive bourgeois demand for nationalization of the land. A demand which, however, frightens most of the bourgeoisie because it would too closely affect another monopoly, one that is particularly important and, quote, sensitive today, the monopoly of the means of production in general. A remarkably popular, concise, and clear exposition of his theory of the average rate of profit on capital and of absolute ground rent is given by Marx himself in a letter to Engels dated August 2nd, 1862. With reference to the history of ground rent, it is also important to note Marx's analysis showing how labor rent, the peasant creates surplus product by working on the Lord's land, is transformed into rent paid in produce or in kind. The peasant creates surplus product on his own land and hands it over to the landlord because of, quote, non-economic constraint, then into money rent, rent in kind, which is converted into money, the obrok of old Russia, as a result of the development of commodity production, and finally into capitalist rent, when the peasant is replaced by the agricultural entrepreneur who cultivates the soil with the help of hired labor. In connection with this analysis of the, quote, genesis of capitalistic ground rent, note should be taken of a number of profound ideas of particular importance to backwards countries like Russia, expressed by Marx regarding the evolution of capitalism in agriculture. Quote, the transformation of rent in kind into money rent is furthermore not only inevitably accompanied, but even anticipated by the formation of a class of propertyless day laborers who hire themselves out for money. During their genesis, when this new class appears but sporadically, the custom necessarily develops among the more prosperous peasants, subject to rent payments, of exploiting agricultural wage laborers for their own account, much as in feudal times when the more well-to-do peasant serfs themselves also hold serfs. In this way, they gradually acquire the possibility of accumulating a certain amount of wealth and themselves become transformed into future capitalists. The old self-employed possessors of land themselves just give rise to a nursery school for capitalist tenants, whose development is conditioned by the general development of capitalist production beyond the bounds of the countryside. Capital, Volume 3. Quote, the expropriation and eviction of a part of the agricultural population not only set free for industrial capital the laborers, their means of subsistence and material for labor, it also created the home market, end quote, Capital, Volume 1. In their turn, the impoverishment and ruin of the rural population play a part in the creation, for capital, of a reserve army of labor. In every capitalist country, quote, part of the agricultural population is therefore constantly on the point of passing over into an urban or manufacturing, i.e. non-agricultural proletariat. This source of relative surplus population is thus constantly flowing. The agricultural laborer is therefore reduced to the minimum of wages and always stands with one foot already in the swamp of pauperism, end quote, Capital, Volume 1. The peasant's private ownership of the land he tills is the foundation of small-scale production and the condition for its prospering and achieving the classical form. But such small-scale production is compatible only with a narrow and primitive framework of production and society. Under capitalism, the, quote, exploitation of the peasant differs only in form from the exploitation of the industrial proletariat. The exploiter is the same, capital. The individual capitalists exploit the individual peasant through mortgages and usury. The capital class exploits the peasant class through the state taxes, end quote, the class struggles in France. Quote, the small holding of the peasant is now only the pretext that allows the capitalist to draw profits, interest and rent from the soil, while leaving it to the tiller of the soil themselves to see how they can extract the wages. The 18th Brumaire. As a rule, the peasant cedes to capitalist society, i.e. to the capitalist class, even a part of the wages, sinking, quote, to the level of the Irish tenant farmer, all under the pretense of being a private proprietor, end quote, the class struggles in France. What is, quote, one of the reasons why grain prices are lower in countries with predominant small peasant land proprietorship than in countries with a capitalist mode of production, end quote, Capital, Volume 3. It is that the peasant hands over gratis to society, i.e. the capitalist class, a part of his surplus product. Quote, this lower price of grain and other agricultural produce is consequently a result of the producer's poverty and by no means of their labor productivity, end quote, Capital, Volume 3. Under capitalism, the small holding system, which is the normal form of small-scale production, degenerates, collapses, and perishes. Quote, proprietorship of land parcels, by its very nature, excludes the development of social productive forces of labor, social forms of labor, social concentration of capital, large-scale cattle raising, and the progressive application of science. Usury and a taxation system must impoverish it everywhere. The expenditure of capital in the price of the land withdraws this capital from cultivation, an infinite fragmentation of means of production and isolation of the producers themselves, end quote. Cooperative societies, i.e. associations of small peasants, while playing an extremely progressive bourgeois role, only weakens this tendency without eliminating it, nor must it be forgotten that these cooperative societies do much for the well-to-do of peasants and very little, next to nothing, for the mass of poor peasants. Then the associations themselves become exploiters of hired labor. Quote, monstrous waste of human energy, progressive deterioration of conditions of production, and increased prices of means of production, an inevitable law of proprietorship of parcels, end quote, Capital Volume 3. In agriculture, as in industry, capitalism transforms the process of production only at the price of, quote, the martyrdom of the producer. Quote, the dispersion of the rural laborers over larger areas breaks their power of resistance, while concentration increases that of the town operatives. In modern agriculture, as in the urban industries, the increased productiveness and quantity of the labor set in motion are bought at the cost of laying waste and consuming by disease labor power itself. Moreover, all progress in capitalistic agriculture is a progress in the art, not only of robbing the laborer, but of robbing the soil. Capitalist production, therefore, develops technology and the combining together of various processes into a social whole, only by sapping the original sources of all wealth, the soil and the laborer, end quote, Capital, Volume 3. Part 4, Socialism. From the foregoing, it is evident that Marx deduces the inevitability of the transformation of capitalist society into socialist society, and wholly and exclusively from the economic law of the development of contemporary society. The socialization of labor, which is advancing ever more rapidly in thousands of forms, and has manifested itself very strikingly during the half-century since the death of Marx, in growth of large-scale production, capitalist cartels, syndicates, and trusts, as well as in the gigantic increase in the dimensions and power of finance capital, provides the principal material foundation for the inevitable advent of socialism. The intellectual and moral motive force and the physical executor of this transformation is the proletariat, which has been trained by capitalism itself. The proletariat's struggle against the bourgeoisie, which finds expression in a variety of forms ever richer in content, inevitably becomes a political struggle directed towards the conquest of political power by the proletariat, the dictatorship of the proletariat. The socialization of production cannot but lead to the means of production becoming the property of society, to the expropriation of the expropriators. A tremendous rise in labor productivity, a shorter working day, and the replacement of the remnants, the ruins of small-scale, primitive, and disunited production by collective and improved labor. Such are the direct consequences of this transformation. Capitalism breaks for all time the ties between agriculture and industry, but at the same time, through its highest developed, it prepares new elements of those ties, a union between industry and agriculture based on the conscious application of science and the concentration of collective labor, and on a redistribution of the human population, thus putting an end both to rural backwardness, isolation, and barbarism, and to the unnatural concentration of vast masses of people in big cities. A new form of family, new conditions in the status of women and in the upbringing of the younger generation are prepared by the highest forms of present-day capitalism. The labor of women and children and the breakup of the patriarchal family by capitalism inevitably assume the most terrible, disastrous, and repulsive forms in modern society. Nevertheless, quote, modern industry, by assigning as it does an important part in the socially organized process of production outside the domestic sphere to women, to young persons, and to children of both sexes, creates a new economic foundation for a higher form of the family and of the relations between the sexes. It is, of course, just as absurd to hold the Teutonic Christian form of the family to be absolute and final, as it would be to apply that character to the ancient Roman, the ancient Greek, or the Eastern forms, which, moreover, taken together form a series in historic development. Moreover, it is obvious that the fact of the collective working group being composed of individuals of both sexes and all ages must necessarily, under suitable conditions, become a source of human development. Although in its spontaneously developed, brutal, capitalistic form, where the laborer exists for the process of production and not the process of production for the laborer, that fact is a pestiferous source of corruption and slavery. Unquote. Capital, Volume 1, end of Chapter 13. The factory system contains, quote, the germ of the education of the future, an education that will, in the ease of every child over a given age, combine productive labor with instruction in gymnastics, not only as one of the methods of adding to the efficiency of social production, but as the only method of producing fully developed human beings. Capital, Volume 1, end of Chapter 13, unquote. Marx's socialism places the problems of nationality and of the state on the same historical footing, not only in the sense of explaining the past, but also in the sense of a bold forecast of the future and a bold practical action for its achievement. Nations are an inevitable product, an inevitable form in the bourgeois epoch of social development. The working class could not grow strong, become mature, and take shape without, quote, constituting itself within the nation, without being, quote, national, quote, though not in the bourgeois sense of the word. The development of capitalism, however, breaks down national barriers more and more, does away with national seclusion, and substitutes class antagonisms for national antagonism. It is therefore perfectly true of the developed capitalist countries that, quote, the working men have no country, and that, quote, united action by the workers of the civilized countries at least, quote, is one of the first conditions for the emancipation of the proletariat. Communist Manifesto. That state, which is organized coercion, inevitably came into being at a definite stage in the development of society, when the latter had split into irreconcilable classes and could not exist without an authority, ostensibly standing above society and to a certain degree separate from society. Arising out of class contradictions, the state becomes, quote, the state of the most powerful, economically dominant class, which through the medium of the state becomes also the politically dominant class and thus acquires new means of holding down and exploiting the oppressed class. Thus, the state of antiquity was above all the state of the slaveholders for the purpose of holding down the slaves, as the feudal state was the organ of the nobility for holding down the peasant serfs and bondsmen, and the modern representative state is an instrument of exploitation of wage labor by capital. End quote. Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, a work in which the writer expounds his own views on Marx's. Even the democratic republic, the freest and most progressive form of the bourgeois state, does not eliminate this fact in any way, but merely modifies its form. The links between government and the stock exchange, the corruption, direct and indirect, of officialdom and the press, etc. By leading to the abolition of classes, socialism will thereby lead to the abolition of the state as well. Quote, the first act, Engels writes in Anti-Düring, by virtue of which the state really constitutes itself the representative of society as a whole, the taking possession of the means of production in the name of society, is, at the same time, its last independent act as a state. The state interference in social relations becomes superfluous in one sphere after another, and then ceases of itself. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things and by the direction of the processes of production. The state is not abolished, it withers away, end quote, Anti-Düring. Quote, the society that will organize production on the basis of a free and equal association of the producers will put the whole machinery of state where it will then belong, into the Museum of Antiquities by the side of the spinning wheel and the bronze axe, end quote, Engels, The Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State. Finally, as regards the attitude of Marxist socialism towards the small peasantry, which will continue to exist in the period of the expropriation of the expropriators, we must refer to a declaration made by Engels, which expresses Marx's views, quote, when we are in possession of state power, we shall not even think of forcibly expropriating the small peasants, regardless of whether with or without compensation, as we shall have to do in the case of the big landowners. Our task relative to the small peasant consists, in the first place, in effecting a transition of his private enterprise and private possession to cooperative ones, not forcibly but by dint of example and the proffer of social assistance for this purpose. And then, of course, we shall have ample means of showing to the small peasant prospective advantages that must be obvious to him even today. End quote. Engels, The Peasant Question in France and Germany, published by Alexeyeva. There are errors in the Russian translation. Original in Die Neue Zeit. Section 5. Tactics of the Class Struggle of the Proletariat. After examining as early as 1844 to 45, one of the main shortcomings in the earlier materialism, namely its inability to understand the conditions or appreciate the importance of practical revolutionary activity, Marx, along with his theoretical work, devoted unremitting attention throughout his lifetime to the tactical problems of the proletariat's class struggle. An immense amount of material bearing on this is contained in all the works of Marx, particularly in the 4 volumes of his correspondence with Engels published in 1913. This material is still far from having been brought together, collected, examined, and studied. We shall therefore have to confine ourselves here to the most general and brief remarks, emphasizing that Marx justly considered that, without this aspect, materialism is incomplete, one-sided, and lifeless. The fundamental task of proletarian tactics was defined by Marx in strict conformity with all the postulates of his materialist dialectical Weltanschauung, or worldview. Only an objective consideration of the sum total of the relations between absolutely all the classes in a given society, and consequently a consideration of the objective stage of development reached by that society and of the relations between it and other societies, can serve as a basis for the correct tactics of an advanced class. At the same time, all classes in all countries are regarded not statistically but dynamically, i.e. not in a state of immobility but in motion, whose laws are determined by the economic conditions of the existence of each class. Motion, in its turn, is regarded from the standpoint not only of the past but also of the future, and that not in the vulgar sense it is understood by the evolutionists, who see only slow changes but dialectically, quote, in developments of such magnitude 20 years are no more than a day, Marx wrote to Engels, though later on there may come days in which 20 years are embodied, end quote, Briefwechsel, Volume 3, page 127. At each stage of development, at each moment, proletarian tactics must take account of this objectively inevitable dialectics of human history. On the one hand, utilizing the periods of political stagnation or of sluggish, so-called peaceful development in order to develop the class consciousness, strength, and militancy of the advanced class, and, on the other hand, directing all the work of this utilization towards the, quote, ultimate aim of that class's advance, towards creating in it the ability to find practical solutions for great tasks in the great days, in which, quote, 20 years are embodied. 2 of Marx's arguments are of special importance in this connection. One of these is contained in The Poverty of Philosophy and concerns the economic struggle and economic organizations of the proletariat. The other is contained in the Communist Manifesto and concerns the asks of the proletariat. The former runs as follows, quote, large-scale industry concentrates in one place a crowd of people unknown to one another. Competition divides their interests. But in the maintenance of wages, this common interest, which they have against their boss, unites them in a common thought of resistance, combination. Combinations at first isolated constitute themselves into groups, and in face of always united capital, the maintenance of the association becomes more necessary to them, i.e. the workers, than that of wages. In this struggle, a veritable civil war, all the elements necessary for coming battle unite and develop. Once it has reached this point, association takes on a political character. Marx, The Poverty of Philosophy, 1847, unquote. Here we have the program and tactics of the economic struggle and of the trade union movement for several decades to come, for all the lengthy period in which the proletariat will prepare its forces for the, quote, coming battle. All this should be compared with numerous references by Marx and Engels to the example of the British labor movement, showing how industrial, quote, property leads to attempts, quote, to buy the proletariat, to divert them from the struggle, how this prosperity in general, quote, demoralizes the workers, how the British proletariat becomes, quote, bourgeoisified, quote, this most bourgeois of all nations is apparently aiming ultimately at the possession of a bourgeois aristocracy and a bourgeois proletariat alongside the bourgeoisie, how the British workers' leaders are becoming a type midway between, quote, a radical bourgeois and a worker, how owning to Britain's monopoly, and as long as that monopoly lasts, quote, the British working man will not budge. The tactics of the economic struggle in connection with the general course and outcome of the working class movement are considered here from a remarkably broad, comprehensive, dialectical, and genuinely revolutionary standpoint. the Communist Manifesto advanced a fundamental Marxist principle on the tactics of the political struggle. Quote, the communists must fight for the attainment of the immediate aims, for the enforcement of the momentary interests of the working class. But in the movement of the present, they also represent and take care of the future of that movement, unquote. That was why, in 1848, Marx supported the party of the, quote, agrarian revolution in Poland, quote, that party which brought about the Krakow insurrection in 1846. In Germany, Marx, in 1848 and 1849, supported the extreme revolutionary Democrats, and subsequently never retracted what he had then said about tactics. He regarded the German bourgeoisie as an element which was, quote, inclined from the very beginning to betray the people, unquote. Only an alliance with the peasantry could have enabled the bourgeoisie to completely achieve its aims, quote, and compromise with the crowned representatives of the old society, unquote. Here is Marx's summing up of the German bourgeois democratic revolution, an analysis which, incidentally, is a sample of a materialism that examines society in motion, and, moreover, not only from the aspect of a motion that is backward, quote, without faith in itself, without faith in the people, grumbling at those above, trembling before those below, intimidated by the world storm, no energy in any respect, plagiarism in every respect, without initiative, an execrable old man who saw himself doomed to guide and deflect the first youthful impulses of a robust people in his own senile interests, unquote. About 20 years later, Marx declared in a letter to Engels that the revolution of 1848 had failed because the bourgeoisie had preferred peace with slavery to the mere prospect of a fight for freedom. When the revolutionary period of 1848 to 49 ended, Marx opposed any attempt to play at revolution, his struggle against Schapper and Willich, and insisted on the ability to work in a new phase, which in a quasi, quote, peaceful way, was preparing new revolutions. The spirit in which Marx wanted this work to be conducted is to be seen in his appraisal of the situation in Germany in 1856, the darkest period of reaction. Quote, the whole thing in Germany will depend on the possibility of backing the proletarian revolution by some second edition of the Peasant War. While the democratic bourgeois revolution in Germany was uncompleted, Marx focused every attention in the tactics of the socialist proletariat on developing the democratic energy of the peasantry. He held that Lassalle's attitude was, quote, objectively a betrayal of the whole workers' movement to Prussia, unquote, incidentally because Lassalle was tolerant of the Junkers and Prussian nationalism. Quote, in a predominantly agricultural country, Engels wrote in 1865 in exchanging views with Marx on their forthcoming joint declaration in the press, quote, it is dastardly to make an exclusive attack on the bourgeoisie in the name of the industrial proletariat, but never to devote a word to the patriarchal exploitation of the rural proletariat under the lash of the great feudal aristocracy. From 1864 to 1870, when the period of the consummation of the bourgeois democratic revolution in Germany was coming to an end, a period in which the Prussian and Austrian exploiting classes were struggling to complete that revolution in one way or another from above, Marx not only rebuked Lassalle, who was coquetting with Bismarck, but also corrected Liebknecht, who had, quote, lapsed into Austrophilism and a defense of particularism. Marx demanded revolutionary tactics which would combat with equal ruthlessness both Bismarck and the Austrophiles, tactics which would not be adapted to the, quote, victor, the Prussian Junkers, but would immediately renew the revolutionary struggle against him despite the conditions created by the Prussian military victories. In the celebrated address of the International of September 9, 1870, Marx warned the French proletariat against an untimely uprising. But when an uprising nevertheless took place, 1871, Marx enthusiastically hailed the revolutionary initiative of the masses who were, quote, storming heaven, Marx's letter to Kuhlmann. From the standpoint of Marx's dialectical materialism, the defeat of revolutionary action in that situation, as in many other, was a lesser evil in the general course and outcome of the proletarian struggle than the abandonment of a position already occupied, than surrender without battle. Such a surrender would have demoralized the proletariat and weakened its militancy. While fully appreciating the use of legal means of struggle during periods of political stagnation and the domination of bourgeois legality, Marx in 1877 and 1878 followed the passage of the anti-socialist law, sharply condemned Most's, quote, revolutionary phrases. No less sharply, if not more so, did he attack the opportunism that had for a time come over the official Social Democratic Party, which did not at once display resoluteness, firmness, revolutionary spirit, and the readiness to resort to an illegal struggle in response to the anti-socialist law. This is the end of the recording. As I mentioned in the beginning of this file, there's also a bibliography section, which I'm not reading in. If you'd like to read that, you can just click on the link in the video description. There are also extensive endnotes and side notes for each section of this, which I think is just too clunky to read as an audiobook. So again, if you'd like to check those out and follow all the little side notes, you can do that by clicking on the link. This has been installment number 2 in the basic Marxist-Leninist study plan. You can find that.
So this has been my daily routine. Meditation, yoga, martial arts, and some reading before that. So please like, share, and subscribe. I'm going to clean up the room now. And I encourage you to practice along with me. And I'll play some motivational stuff here while I clean up.
Akira, the scuba training, they would do very traumatic things to you underwater with your scuba gear on, rip it off, rip your face mask off, tie your regulator hoses in knots, just create total mayhem. And eventually they do things that are so horrible to you that you have to come to the surface. And when you came to the surface, what they told you to do immediately was say the words, I feel fine. I feel fine. I feel fine. I feel fine. He said it was some proof that you were neurologically okay. I'm not sure if I believe that. I think what they were really doing was programming us for when there's total mayhem and chaos, we get a chance to get our breath. Instead of freaking out, we just look up and say, I feel fine. Instead of freaking out, we just look up and say, I feel fine. 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 That's my advice. No matter what kind of chaos and mayhem you are facing, look at the world and just say, I feel fine. Let's get something.
Jocko, I am a chronic excuse maker. How do I stop making excuses and get things done?
Chronic excuse maker. How do you stop making excuses? This is actually pretty simple. I said it the other day, you have to realize, you have to know, you have to accept that all your excuses are lies. All your excuses are lies. Think about the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. away. Who cares? That's a lie. Or you're too old, or you're too young. Of course, you're too old or too young. Lie. And there's you're too busy. Sure you are. That's a lie. Your excuses are lies. Your excuses are lies. Think of the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. You're too tired, or you're too sore, or you're just plain not feeling it. Lies, lies, lies. And the list goes on and on and on. And it doesn't stop if you don't make it stop. So recognize the excuses are not valid. They aren't. They're trumped up. They're conjured up. They're fabricated. They're lies. Your excuses are lies. Your excuses are lies. Think of the lies you use to rationalize taking the easy road. Taking the easy road and leaving discipline behind. Your excuses are lies. And how do you stop the lies? You stop the lies with the truth. The truth. The truth will set you free.
All right, that's it for the day.